Recently, in our Jewish film club, we took a look at how Yom Kippur is depicted in Jewish movies and TV shows. And in one section, we looked at how the jazz singer depicts one of the prayers of Yom Kippur, but it also takes a really deep look at Jewishness. And that's been a topic I've been thinking about a lot recently. And so this week on Yiddishkeit, I want to take a look at the story and the legacy of the jazz singer. Hey, if you're new here, my name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we talk about the experience of Jewishness. Now, personally, I experienced my own Jewishness by analyzing Jewish history, culture, and art. And this story of the jazz singer is such a great example of all three of these things because it uses the visual art of film to capture this central Jewish question of living between two worlds, or tradition versus modernity. In case you missed the Yom Kippur video, we talked about how the jazz singer captures a big element of this Jewish holiday because it contemplates a central Jewish theme. And it does that by using the prayer of Kol Nidre, which is the opening service of the holiday of Yom Kippur, which is featured prominently in the original jazz singer from 1927. But then we also went on to explain that there are many other retellings of the jazz singer and many other stories which are jazz singer-esque. So let me play you a brief clip from that episode where we talk about the prayer Kol Nidre, but also how it basically comes to be the backbone of the story of the jazz singer from 1927. So forgive me if you've seen this video already, but I think you'll find that it'll help put everything else we're about to talk about into sharper relief. The story is about a young man named Jakey Rabinowitz and his father, the cantor, the person who leads the services in synagogue. Now, the cantor is portrayed with the long white beard, and he has a very rabbi vibe to him, even though that's just implied in the story. And as the story goes, young Jakey is not interested in being a cantor, but rather singing jazz songs in a local bar. And so there's this scene when Yom Kippur is approaching, and the father is waiting for Jakey to come home, and then afterwards go with him to synagogue and say the Kol Nidre prayer. But then the father finds out that Jakey is actually singing in a bar. He goes and removes him from the bar and brings him home. And later on in that scene, he essentially disowns him. And then the father goes alone to shul as they're starting the services. They're taking the Torah scrolls out of the ark and beginning to sing the song of Kol Nidre. This is an extremely sad and emotional scene because of their seemingly irreparable differences. The father feels like he just lost a son. And while the Kol Nidre prayer is going on, it cuts back to the home where Jakey returns to gather a few belongings before he runs away and goes out west. The next scene is already many years later where Jakey has grown up and he's changed his name to Jack Robin and he's singing in a restaurant. But later on in the story, when Jack Robin has already found some success, he's performing in New York and a messenger comes to him and says that his father's very ill and he's not able to sing in the shul that night, and they ask Jack to step in. And as they're discussing, I want to highlight one moment that's probably the most meaningful in that entire conversation. Let me paint for you the final scene of this movie where their father's laying in bed, quite ill, probably about to die. His wife, the Jack's mother, is there, as well as the doctor and the messenger from the congregation, as well as Jack is standing there, and there's also the love interest from Broadway and his manager from Broadway. In that moment, Jack finds himself pulled between two worlds, and he has to choose between performing in a show that he's been dreaming of for years or taking his father's place in the synagogue. And at the end, when Jack takes his father's place in the shul, we can see that God was truly in his voice, since the Father acknowledges it. And once the Father passes away, his spirit appears behind Jack as he's praying and puts his hand on his shoulder. And this again is to affirm that Jack is singing with God. And the final piece of evidence that God was truly in his voice was the fact that the people from Broadway who tried to convince him to do the show that night by saying that you're a jazz singer at heart had to admit that this was a jazz singer singing to his God. I want to unpack this story with you. I want to go a couple of steps back and look at the world into which this story is operating, the background of being between two worlds, the setting of the jazz singer, which is the Lower East Side and America in general, and then try to unpack some of the messages that are in the story, the conversations that these films are having with each other and with us. We all live between two worlds, order and chaos, old and new. But Jews in particular have been living between two worlds, particularly in the sense that they've been both insiders and outsiders at the same time. The most famous example of this in Jewish culture is arguably the movie The Dybbuk, whose subtitle is Between Two Worlds. The title of this movie is about the soul of the protagonist, Chanan, whose soul can't enter heaven, but also can't return to his body. And so it's stuck in this no man's land, and so his soul begins to possess his beloved named Leah. Among the many ideas in this movie, one of them is that this idea of being between two worlds is also a metaphor for Jewishness, which is both a product of heaven, of God and the Torah, but also a product of this world, humans who interpret and actually practice these rituals. And so it's during this time period in the 1800s that we begin to see this tension start to look the way we know it today. The older way supports looking discreetly Jewish and being insular from the popular culture, while the newer way decides to adapt to the modern surroundings. This tension can be traced all the way back to at least the Hellenist period, where we have the Maccabees who embody this tension, which famously gives us the holiday of Hanukkah. But it's in the 19th century that it crystallizes into the three words that we know today, which are tradition versus modernity. And that's a topic which, as you probably know, I love to talk about. To understand how the jazz singer is talking to us about this tension between tradition and modernity, we need to take a look at Jewishness in America during that time. When the first Jews arrived in America back in 1654, they were met with opposition from the leadership, specifically from Peter Stuyvesant. He still had a lot of what we would call old school prejudice, and although his main concern was not wanting to support them financially, he found the language of intolerance in order to express that. It was during the British time where this idea of self-governance began to emerge, and of course after the revolution in the new country, this idea of Jews being able to integrate into society became possible while still maintaining a distinct faith. But as the 1800s progressed, this first settlement of Jews, as well as some newcomers, began to amass wealth and rise up into the upper middle class. And so their story of Jewishness in America looks very different from the next wave of Jewish immigration, which was about to happen at the end of the 1800s. Starting in the 1880s all the way through the 1920s, over 2 million Jews came from the Russian Empire to America, and many of them settled on the Lower East Side of New York. This group of Jews who were coming from the Russian Empire had lived a really insular life in the shtetl, the towns that they lived in, and they didn't have much agency in terms of their Jewishness because of the traditions in place and also because of the persecution that held them back. But now that they've come to America, this generation was thrust between these two worlds on a scale of which no generation has faced before and arguably since. And so it's by looking at this generation of the Great Wave, as well as the children of this generation, the so-called children of the ghetto, we get an insight into how this battle of tradition versus modernity was playing out in that generation. So there's this book called The Jews in America by Arthur Hertzberg, and in it there's a chapter called The Invention of the Jewish Mother. And in it, there's a quote from this journalist from the 20th century called Lincoln Steffens, and I want to read you a short section. What struck him with particular force was the break in religion between fathers and sons. Steffens described it in his autobiography as a tragic struggle. And this next section is a quote from Steffens himself. We would pass a synagogue where a score or more boys were sitting hatless in their old clothes, smoking cigarettes on the steps outside, and their fathers, all dressed in black with their high hats, uncut beards, and temple curls, were going into the synagogue, tearing their hair and rending their garments. Their sons were rebels against the law of Moses. They were lost souls, lost to God, the family, and to the Israel of old. And later on in the book, Herzberg also quotes a Yiddish writer named Shalom Ash, and this is what Herzberg has to say. Shalom Ash, one of the most famous of the Yiddish writers, confirmed these observations. He did not settle in America till after the First World War, but in 1910 he paid a visit of 5 months. Ash found that Jewish parents from the Old World and their Americanized children were more alien to each other than Jews anywhere else in the world. That, my friends, is a really powerful statement. And we can see this separation and divide in the movie The Jazz Singer from 1980. There's a particular theme in that movie of the idea that you need to know where you come from to know where you're going. And it's an idea that I've referenced on this channel before in other contexts because it's really such a central Jewish idea and human idea. So I want to play you a brief clip from a video I made last year about The Jazz Singer from 1980, where I explain how the characters in the story embody this idea of tradition and modernity, which Steffens, Herzberg, and Ash all described. What's interesting about this movie is it points out the whole conflict between Jesse and his dad, between tradition and modernity, is all about the direction a person is looking in. The traditionalists, the father, the rabbi, Rifki, are all looking to the past, while the modernists, Jesse and Molly, are looking towards the future. Throughout the whole movie, at different points, characters repeat this line of, you need to know where you come from to know where you're going. For example, when Jesse first tells his dad about the fact that he's writing songs and performing them, and he wants to become a rock star, his dad obviously resists the idea. And the reason that he gives is interesting. He invokes the death of the people who perished in Europe.
There are some things is more important not to change. Our people were killed for saying a prayer a certain way. We owe it to them to keep on saying it their way. You can't change what has always been. That's how you know where you stand, who you are.
To the father, Jewish tradition was about preserving the past, preserving the memories of the people who passed.
And if you don't know where you come from, how do you know where you're going?
And Rifki also echoes this exact sentiment. There's a moment where she meets Molly for the first time during a concert that Jesse's putting on to like a packed theater of people.
How can you leave all this? Does he have to? It's more complicated than that, Molly. You can't understand. We're different. It goes back to our parents.
To her, upholding tradition, or in a sense, preserving the memories of the people before her, is the most important thing.
You're right, Rivka. I don't understand. I know very little about where he comes from, about you or the hold you all seem to have on him, but I know where he's going. Listen to him.
And that is why Jesse ends up with Molly, because she understands Jesse's ambition. That's probably what brought her to LA in the first place. And they are both of the same mind that you can't let the past hold you back. And so now with all this background, I think the setting begins to make a lot more sense. We can see how the main character in these stories is represented by J.K. Rabinowitz in the original retelling, who as a young boy is interested in performing jazz for a Gentile audience. And then as he gets older and pursues his dream, he also wants to intermarry with someone out of the faith. This idea of intermarriage you may recognize from the movie Fiddler on the Roof. Although in the famous movie from the 70s by Norman Jewison, the idea of being between two worlds is a bit obscured by the music and the big production value. In the Yiddish version called Tevya, it's a lot more explicit about this idea that his daughter Chava, by marrying a Gentile, has officially crossed over into another world. And in that film, he also openly mourns Chava's loss, just like the father in The Jazz Singer and as Lincoln Steffens described in The Lower East Side. And to the father, this is tantamount to death. This is worse than death. But to the second generation, to the son or daughter, these goals are worth pursuing. In fact, they often change their name in pursuit of them. And this point of changing one's name in order to blend into the Gentile world was something that was extremely prominent in Hollywood and captures another big element of these stories. To help us understand this a little more, I want to play you a clip from a documentary called Hollywoodism: Jews, Movies, and the American Dream. This is an amazing documentary made by one of my favorite Jewish creators of all time, named Simcha Yakubovich. And he also has this incredible show about biblical archaeology called The Naked Archaeologist. It's one of my favorite shows. And if you're remotely interested in that topic, I highly recommend his stuff. And in that documentary, Hollywoodism, he talks about The Jazz Singer, but he also points out how many of the big stars in early Hollywood during the Mogul era were actually, young Jewish boys and girls who changed their name for the big stage.
Often the first thing to go was the Jewish name. The Hollywood Jews were obsessed with erasing anything Jewish in their films, their lives, and the lives of their stars. Theodosia Goodman became Theda Bara. Sofia Kosso became Sylvia Sidney. Isser Danielovich Dembski became Kirk Douglas. Leo Jacobi became Lee J. Cobb. Shirley Shrift became Shelley Winters. Bernard Schwartz became Tony Curtis. David Kaminsky became Danny Kaye. Edward Iskevitz became Eddie Cantor. Melvin Hesselberg became Melvin Douglas. Muni Wiesenfreund, a star of the Yiddish theater, became Paul Muni. Emmanuel Goldenberg became Edward G. Robinson. The G was a reminder of who he really was. Nice Jewish girls, such as Lily Palmer, Julie Holliday, and Lauren Bacall, or Betty Persky, helped to define the American woman.
What's really interesting about the original Jazz Singer from 1927 is that the Jazz Singer, Jack Robin, is played by Al Jolson, and he shares a lot of similarities with the character he played. First of all, he also changes his name from Asa Yudelson to Al Jolson, and in the story, he changed his name from Jakey Rabinowitz to Jack Robin. And second of all, Al Jolson is also the son of a cantor, just like Jack Robin. In fact, in the documentary, they also point out how many of the big names in music in the early 20th century were in fact made by the sons of cantors. Most famously, perhaps, is Irving Berlin, who not only created some of the most famous American songs from the 20th century, but in fact was awarded by 3 different presidents. But the real reason I bring up this documentary, Hollywoodism, is because it's the first place where I've heard of the film Overture to Glory. At that point, I had already seen the 1927 film, but now I was hearing about how there was this Yiddish counter-narrative, and these two films were having a dialogue with each other. And so I want to play you that clip from that documentary, which really set the course for a lot of interesting thoughts and conversations.
Not all the Jewish talent went to Hollywood to assimilate. There were over 50 non-Hollywood Yiddish films produced in New York before the Second World War. These films were the flip side of the Hollywood movies. They parodied Hollywood's optimism. Many who could have gone to Hollywood stayed in New York to make films that expressed their Jewish identity.
These films were shown to an audience which was almost entirely made up of immigrants and sometimes the children of immigrants, and these films, by and large, had a very, very different point of view than Hollywood movies. I mean, the Yiddish movies were kind of fighting a rearguard action to protect certain forms of Jewish cultural expression against the sort of overwhelming, seductive power of the larger American culture.
In this classic of Yiddish cinema, a great cantor, played by Moshe Oisher, is drawn into the secular world of opera. On the night of his operatic debut, he learns of his son's death. Unable to perform, he returns to his synagogue to lead the high holiday prayers. Heartbroken, he dies. Here the attempt to reconcile Jewish and secular worlds ends tragically. Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer was a revolutionary silent film that broke into sound with each musical number. Here, as in the Yiddish film, a cantor's son, played by Al Jolson, who was in real life a cantor's son, has to choose between American fame and Jewish loyalty. At first, the cantor's son seems to choose Judaism. But in assimilationist Hollywood, the story could not end there. Hollywood had to have a Hollywood ending. Again and again in Hollywood films, the old world father is rejected, the mother is idealized, and the rebellious son sails on to glory.
What's really interesting about this movie is that it is very explicit about the fact that the main character, the cantor slash opera singer, is stuck between two worlds. So let me play you the clip from the Yom Kippur episode summarizing the film Overture to Glory, how it contrasts with the jazz singer, but also I want you to catch the moment in the film that is explicit about the idea of being between two worlds. The story is about a man who's a cantor in Vilna, and he leaves his wife and child to go to Warsaw to take part in the opera. And what happens is that not only does he fall in love with the music and the culture, but also with another woman. What's interesting about this movie is that it's much, much more explicit about the themes of being trapped between two worlds and having to choose between tradition and modernity.
Ein Größkeit ist gewesen bei Nume. Wenn sie sind gekommen, sie ins dich Herren, einen mir der Leben. Bis die übergehen zu sehen, bis die stehen bleiben zwischen beide Welten, wie nirgends nicht sein kann.
And although the cantor does achieve success in the opera world, we can see that he is tortured by his own success. And so the film comes to an end with him learning about the death of his own child, rendering him incapable of doing any more performances in the opera, and eventually he makes his trek home and arrives on the eve of Yom Kippur and walks into shul while they're reciting Kol Nidre. He takes over in middle of the service, and we can see how he's pouring out his soul about all the mistakes that he feels he made. But instead of the happy endings that we've seen in the jazz singer of moving on and having a successful career in jazz and even having acceptance from the father, in this case, after he's done that prayer, the cantor drops dead. And this, of course, is the film's message of the catastrophic nature of abandoning one's family and tradition. So there's this little tradition on this channel, which is that every year around Yom Kippur time, we discuss the jazz singer. This year, we talked about several jazz singers, 27, 1980, and Overture to Glory, as well as other characters that seem to be jazz singer-esque. Last year, we covered the jazz singer from 1980, and 2 years ago, we covered the jazz singer from 1927. One thing that I've always wanted to do was to compare every single jazz singer retelling, and there was a little taste of that this year in the Yom Kippur episode. But there's a final point about the jazz singer and being between two worlds that we haven't addressed yet, which is a really glaring, obvious elephant in the room type of question, which is, what does this have to do with Yom Kippur? You see, the Jewish high holidays, including Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is not a day that's explicitly about Jewish identity. It's about, looking at our deeds and making right with our fellow human, with God. But there are other holidays that are dedicated to actually examining Jewish identity, like Passover and Hanukkah. So how come this idea of being between two worlds, being between tradition and modernity, comes out during Yom Kippur? There are many answers to this question. It's kind of like the idea of Pardes. There are many levels of analysis that you can take here. I want to offer two of them. So to explain the first one, let me tell you a little personal story about a trip that I took with my friend Rafi to Washington, D.C. last Rosh Hashanah. And staying there and experiencing Rosh Hashanah in the nation's capital was really interesting and transformative experience for me. So part of that was sounding the shofar in front of the White House. That was pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. Part of it was contemplating my Jewishness in context of being an American during the Jewish New Year. Kind of made things click and align in my brain in a way it otherwise wouldn't. So I want to play you the clip from the video last year, which discusses why Yom Kippur is used to talk about Jewish identity in context of intermarriage and career choices. But the legacy of the jazz singer still continues to this day. For example, in 2020, there was a mini-series called Unorthodox, which is about a Jewish girl coming from a repressive, traditionalist background who then tries to express herself through music. Also, there's this movie that came out in 2018 called The Awakening of Mati Wolkenbruch, which is about a Jewish boy who falls in love with a girl who is not in the faith. And this made me realize something really interesting about the holiday of Yom Kippur. You see, growing up, I thought of the Day of Atonement as this time to reflect on our actions, but also kind of bargain with God. But now that I'm getting older, I'm beginning to realize that there's this whole other meaning to Yom Kippur. And that is, Yom Kippur is also a time to contemplate our Jewish identity.
And a happy Yom Kippur. Night.
Yom Kippur is a time when people who may not go to shul, go to synagogue, will attend services. And even if you're reading the translations and stuff, it's about atonement and also these esoteric services that happened in the old temple in Jerusalem. And it becomes really hard to relate to this stuff in the modern world. And so you begin to think, why am I even here? What am I doing in this synagogue? And the answer is, well, because you're Jewish. So the next question is, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Jewish? So Yom Kippur really has kind of a double layer to it. The surface is about what the holiday is literally about: atonement and sacrifice and God. But the deeper meaning is it's an opportunity for us to search our identity, to ask ourselves, where do we come from and where are we going? And what's so interesting is that there are a ton of movies that do this as well, that talk about Jewish identity, particularly about romantic relationships between someone who is Jewish and someone who isn't, while also using Yom Kippur, or a high holiday service, as part of the story. First up is Liberty Heights, which uses the high holiday service as an important part of the story, but also a huge part of the story is about a Jewish boy falls in love with a girl who is not of the faith.
Just kill me now. Just kill me now.
What are you talking about?
What do you mean she's attractive?
Another example of a very similar plot, which is a little more recent from last year, is called You People, and it's about Jonah Hill's character, who is Jewish, falling in love with someone who isn't Jewish, and the tension that comes about. And again, they use Yom Kippur as a part of the story.
It is Yom Kippur, goddammit.
And I'll give you just one more really crazy example. This movie called The Believer, which stars Ryan Gosling as a Jewish boy who then becomes a neo-Nazi and falls in love with a neo-Nazi girl who wants to become Jewish. Anyways, a big part of that story, without giving spoilers away, is Yom Kippur. In fact, this year, in the Yom Kippur episode, I also gave two more examples, which in their own way had elements of the jazz singer's struggle of being between two worlds. The first of which comes to us from the second season of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, when they did a second Yom Kippur episode. In that episode, the theme is about furthering Miriam's career, and there's this moment where you see how her Jewish holiday and her career conflict.
Phil Mazzarino, East Coast booker we talked about. He wants to see you.
Great. When?
Gaslight, October 12th. Block that night out. He likes you. We are off and running.
I can't.
You can.
It's Yom Kippur.
Who gives a shit?
Susie, Yom Kippur, high holidays, break fast, temple, family, guilt.
There are Gentile bookers who are going to want to see you on Yom Kippur.
There are?
Well, there's one, and he does.
Any other night.
God understands show business. He invented it.
Susie. Okay.
Happy New Year.
I just wanted to point out how jazz singer-esque this moment really was. And at first I would have kind of just dismissed it, but there was a little hint that they knew what they were doing, since the episode also makes reference to Al Jolson, who was the actor that played Jack Robin.
Notice your kid's been stuffing candy bars in his face the entire ceremony. His face is covered in chocolate. He looks like Al Jolson.
Be quiet! The second example comes to us from a movie called Keeping the Faith, which has this scene that takes place during Kol Nidre, which is about this romance that the rabbi is having with someone who isn't Jewish. And so on Yom Kippur Eve, the rabbi comes clean with his congregants.
For a number of months, I've been seeing a woman who isn't Jewish. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and so tonight, I stand before you and ask you to forgive me.
So that's insight number one. But insight number two, which has to do with the prayers that are present in the film Overture to Glory. Overture to Glory is available online, but I also recommend getting this box set. There's a Blu-ray discs that have, I think, about a dozen or so Yiddish films. And there's like a bunch of classics on there and a bunch of deep cuts that you've never heard of. But both the Dybbuk and Overture to Glory and Tevya are all on this set. But the reason to get this box set is because it has audio commentaries that give you a lot of context for these films and explain some of the deeper elements. And for Overture to Glory, it is by Alan Lewis Rickman. The insight is as follows, that the liturgy, the prayers, the things that are said in the congregation that are presented in the story aren't there by accident. The texts actually have a meaning. The writers expect us as the audience to understand what the prayers actually mean. And so they become a kind of exposition for the larger story that takes place in Overture to Glory. But in the Jazz Singer, as an American viewer, you don't know what Kol Nidre means. You don't know what the context is, like what exactly is going on. And so the Jazz Singer from 1927 gives us an insight into tradition versus modernity, but not a good insight into why Yom Kippur. But Overture to Glory does, and it connects us to a whole other world of Yiddish film, which we actually started with by talking about the Dybbuk. And Yiddish film does this amazing thing, which it weaves liturgy, prayers, scripture into the story. And so they become metaphors and keys to understanding the deeper meaning behind it. The movie Overture to Glory opens on Rosh Hashanah when these people from the opera come to view the main character, the cantor, Yoel David, as he's praying for the congregation. And the prayer that Yoel David recites is the opening prayer of the special service that takes place on Rosh Hashanah. The name of that prayer is called Hineni Ha'ani. In that prayer, it talks about how the cantor who is going to lead the congregation in prayer feels unworthy. And so it's this very humbling prayer. There's these moments where the cantor is saying, and do not hold my transgressions against others and things of that nature. And although he's simply just reciting the lines of a prayer, what he's actually doing is foreshadowing what's about to happen, where, as we saw in the clip of Overture to Glory, it ends up affecting his child, it ends up affecting his wife, his town, and then it ends up affecting him, and he is held responsible. And those around him are affected negatively. And so that prayer is shedding light on the ending. And the ending itself happening on Kol Nidre, this statement, which basically says that all of the vows and promises and all the commitments that someone makes that they fell short of, they basically come to that moment and ask the congregation, ask God to annul them. And so this cantor comes to this moment, having fallen short of his commitment to his family, to his community. He comes to this moment and begs the community and God for forgiveness by reciting that prayer. This idea really unlocked a whole new level to this film. The fact that movies are able to do that really blew me away. In fact, the only movies that I've seen able to do that are Yiddish films, with the exception of one English film that I've seen so far called The Believer. In fact, in the Rosh Hashanah video that was released recently, I talk about how The Believer weaves in the story of the binding of Isaac into its narrative and uses it as exposition, especially during the moment where the main character, Daniel, walks into the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah as they're reading the story out of the Bible. That was such a brilliant touch, which went over my head the first couple of times I watched this movie. But by the third time, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't notice that. And that's really cool. This movie goes on to do it a second time with the story of Yonah, which I mentioned in the Yom Kippur episode, where it weaves that story into the ending, where Danny kind of has his Yonah moment in the middle of the storm. If you're still watching, I want to thank you for being here to the end of this video in my sukkah with me. This video was kind of just sharing a bunch of my thoughts about the topic of the jazz singer, which didn't directly fit into the mega episode about how Yom Kippur is depicted. That one was just about the traditions and the rituals and things like that. But the kind of deeper substance, I felt like it deserved its own video, which just got a voice for it. And yeah, as I mentioned several times, I want to come back to these topics of tradition and modernity, about the Debuk being between two worlds, the jazz singer, and how it's retold many, many times, and really exploring and unpacking these topics. I really look forward to doing that with you in the future. In the meantime, if you're interested in Jewish history, culture, and art, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to Yiddishkeit.